From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I want to welcome you all today to this first of a series of programs that are part of a project that the American Folklife Center has been working on for a while. And the series is called Many Paths to Freedom, looking back, looking ahead at the long civil rights movement. But before we welcome our guests today, I want to acknowledge just a few key partners and collaborators, both within the library and externally. Within the library, I want to acknowledge the input and assistance of our colleagues at the Veterans History Project, the Motion Picture, Broadcast and Recorded Sound Division, Education Outreach, the Manuscripts Division, Prints and Photographs, the Office of Strategic Initiatives, and a special thanks to our co-sponsors for today, the library's chapter of Blacks in Government. As you can see, it truly takes a village of federal cultural institutions and divisions to make all of this good work happen. Our external partners include the SNCC Legacy Project, and I hope some of those individuals associated with that project are here in the audience today, and perhaps others are in attendance as well. But very importantly, I want to thank our major partner, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, with whom we have been working with over a 5-year period on a national collecting initiative, the Civil Rights History Project, mandated by Congress. It's been a pleasure to collaborate with Lonnie Bunch and the National Museum of African American History and Culture staff, including, and I just want to acknowledge them all here, Kinshasa Holman Conwill, Rex Ellis, Elaine Nichols, Carlos Bustamante, Dory Butter, Deirdre Cross, and others that I'm sure I'm forgetting here, so please forgive me for that. As the collecting phase of this project is winding down, we at the center have been working hard to make interviews with movement veterans available in their entirety for audiences worldwide and for future individuals through our online portal at the project. And please bookmark that URL right there, go to it and go to it repeatedly. If you haven't already done that, you'll get, if you do that, excuse me, you'll get instant notices about when the site launches, which should be imminent, and information about upcoming programs over the next few months in this series. We hope you will continue to return to the library over the next few months. We have a long several-month period of terrific programs, lectures, roundtable discussions with this series, as well as programs that will be happening sponsored by other divisions throughout the library in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Act. Please come. And please enjoy today. And what I would like to do now is introduce Guha Shankar, our Folklife specialist on staff, who has been coordinating and spearheading the Civil Rights History Project on behalf of the American Folklife Center. I would also like to acknowledge Kate Stewart, who has been working doggedly and with great perseverance and excellence on the project as well. I want to turn it over to Guha, who will introduce our speakers today. So please, welcome Guha, and welcome to you all.
Thank you, and to reiterate Betsy, a really great showing. Lovely to see you all here. Let me just say one or two words about the series. It's scheduled to be many different things at many different times. It features activists, scholars, artists, who will address a range of topics on the theme of the struggle for freedom, social justice, and equality for African Americans, and the long civil rights movement, as you see the title behind me. Programs in the series aim to present audiences with a range of perspectives on the topic, highlight the library's unparalleled collections about the freedom struggle and explore questions about the legacy and influence of the movement. Today, in order not to take too much of the time, we have a special and really terrific program with Glen Pearcy. It's called Documenting the Freedom Struggle in Southwest Georgia. Glen Pearcy is an award-winning filmmaker and photographer who has written, produced, and directed dozens of films, including documentaries for PBS and Turner Network Television. He's done programs for labor unions, consumer organizations, environmental groups, government agencies, and political organizations, television and radio spots for public interest groups, foundations, political candidates, and commercial clients. He does not do bar mitzvahs or weddings, I don't think. His film work, which began in 1968, he did. I stand corrected. This is the interactive portion, not yet, but you can tell me about that later. His film work began in 1968, as he will tell you, when he and his wife Susan, who is also here, joined an important organizing effort of the civil rights movement, the Southwest Georgia Project. The Library of Congress acquired his film materials from Southwest Georgia for its permanent collections in 2012, and he was nominated for an Academy Award in 1975 for the third film, Fighting for Our Lives, a feature-length documentary film about the unit farm workers' 1973 grape strike. He'll be joined today later in the program by another colleague of mine, David Cline, assistant professor at Virginia Tech University. We at the library have no problems in shamelessly exploiting our clients and patrons. David was here doing research in the Korean War and the involvement of African American soldiers, and I said, hey, would you mind joining in the conversation with Glen? And this is how all things work together. About 5 years ago, when David and I started working together in the Civil Rights History Project, he said to me at one point, you know, there's this guy up the street from you in Barnesville, Maryland, who has this amazing collections of films. 5 years ago to this day, thanks to the mediation of David, this is how it all works. David, as I said, is assistant professor in the history department of Virginia Tech. His research focuses on 20th century U.S. social movements, oral history, and public history. He has a particular interest in the role of religious, progressive, and social movements, including the civil rights and women's movements. He is one of the research scholars and interviewers for the Civil Rights History Project, which, when it launches, will feature over 100 interviews streamed in their entirety on the library's portal and through various social media outlets like the library's YouTube channel. And you will hear David's mellifluous questions every once in a while wafting across the screen. So keep him in mind when you see him here in just a couple of minutes. He will also be one of our featured guests next month in the same series that we're presenting, along with a colleague, Adrienne Len-Smith from Duke University, talking about the role and impact of African Americans in World War I and in the Korean War, and how that influenced their activism and in the freedom struggle. So, without further ado, let me please welcome our featured guest for today, Glen Pearcy.
Thank you, Guha. Guha and David Cline, who you'll meet later, are the ones responsible for this day, so I take no responsibility. Guys, could we see if we can knock the lights off the screen so we can see the photographs as good as we can? My first exposure to the movement came in March of 1965. I was a college student and I was a photographer for my college newspaper when the Selma to Montgomery March started. And you all may remember these photographs. This is Bloody Sunday. These are the only photographs you'll see that are not mine. These are news photographs. And when the marchers attempted to start the march from Selma to Montgomery, they were met by state troopers and police and turned back. There were a lot of serious injuries that day, and among them was John Lewis, who was, as you all know, is a congressman from Georgia and has been for quite some time. He's in the upper left quadrant, upper left photo. He was beaten badly that day. We went down, by we, it was me as a photographer and two reporters from my college paper went down, and we went to Montgomery rather than Selma. SNCC was organizing in Montgomery, and they were doing daily marches to the state capitol to try to deliver petitions to Governor George Wallace. As I'm sure you all know the church is a central meeting place for the movement. And SNCC was meeting in the Jackson Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, having daily mass meetings. I'm sure most of you also know that music is central to the movement, always has been. And there have been many iterations of the SNCC Freedom Singers. Whoever was at church that day, whoever got up and sang, those were the Freedom Singers. I don't know the names of these people, but they could sing. James Foreman was the lead organizer in Montgomery while John Lewis was in Selma, and James was kind of the senior member of SNCC in some ways. He was at the ripe old age of 35 at this time, born in 1928. James had served in the Army during the Korean War. His usual uniform was a sport coat over overalls. This is Foreman getting people ready for the one of the daily marches on the Capitol. And every day during this period, the marchers would attempt to go to the Capitol. And they would be met by police who blocked the path. And lots of college kids had come down from the north to work with the local black kids, local black adults. And this is what happened every day. People were stopped, not allowed to get to the Capitol. And when they stood their ground and wouldn't go back, they were turned around by police on horseback. James Bevel, one of Dr. King's lieutenants. After a few days in Montgomery, we went over to Selma to cover some of what was happening over there. This is the White Citizens Council sign outside of town. And the next couple of photographs were taken in and around Selma. The persistence of the Selma and Montgomery demonstrators and the national media attention that it had received provoked a white counter march in Montgomery during this period. I especially love the woman in the center and her pearls and gloves. Dr. King was not present on March 7th, Bloody Sunday, but joined the effort later. I am not sure whether this photograph was taken in Brown's Chapel in Selma, which is where the marchers gathered and where the march originated, or back in Montgomery at the Jackson Street Baptist Church. after Bloody Sunday on the 7th, there was a second attempt 2 days later, I think, on the 9th, which was also turned around. And by that time, there had been so much media attention, and there was, I think, even some federal involvement, that on March 16th, there was a third attempt. And that one was successful. The marchers, I think, marched for the better part of a week, arriving in Montgomery, leaving on the 16th of March and arriving in Montgomery on the 24th. And there was a rally on the 25th. Left to right here is, on the far left is Ralph Abernathy, then James Foreman, who I spoke about earlier. Dr. King is in the center. John Lewis is on the far right. I do not know the name of the person between Dr. King and John Lewis. I bet there's somebody in the audience who does. If so, speak up. I guess not. And I believe this is in Montgomery on the 24th or the 25th, when the marchers finally got to the state capitol. Two years later, my wife Susan and I joined the Southwest Georgia Project. This is one of her paintings from the period. SNCC sent Charles Sherrod to Southwest Georgia in 1961 as its first field secretary. In 1966, Stokely Carmichael was elected chairman of SNCC and reorganized SNCC as an all-black organization. But Sherrod wanted to keep whites in the Southwest Georgia Project, so in an amicable parting of the ways, it became independent of SNCC in 1966-67. We went down in 67. In Southwest Georgia, at least, and in many parts of the country by then, the days of big marches and demonstrations were passing, and it was evolving into more local organizing, economic development, that sort of thing. So my photography from this period is not event-oriented, but is much more intimate, and also because we spent such a relatively long period of time there, a year or two, we got to know people, lived in their homes, so that my photography from this period is much more kind of portrait and intimate-oriented. This is children of the Hall family. We lived in a shack on their farm and were frequent visitors to their home and got to know them well. Rosie Jones on the right, in case it wasn't evident, is blind, which accounts for her expression. Picking cucumbers. One of the first things Charles did with us white kids from the north was give us a taste of life in the field. Another one of Susan's works from her late Van Gogh period. I love this one. Few portraits of staff people on the Southwest Georgia Project. Randy Battle was a young organizer at the time. You'll meet him later in the film I'm going to show. Somebody told me Stick's real name once, but I could never remember it, so it's Stick. Another one of Susan's works. Also from her Van Gogh period. I remember this day very well. All I can think about when I see these photographs is grinding poverty. Barely able to make it. I remember this day very well, too. These are two of the Brown family children. They lived with their parents and 11 siblings in that shack behind them on Itchaway Plantation. Itchaway Plantation was 28,000 acres and was owned by Robert Woodruff, chairman of the board of Coca-Cola, who would have his friends come down for quail hunts and that sort of thing. The Browns were not uncommon. There were plenty of shacks like this with field workers and people who took care of the land. This is Susan's work again. This is the Hawkins family home in Baker County where we were living and working. In addition to picking cucumbers in the field, Charles made sure that folks like us lived with a local family for a period of time. This was a lovely family. House had no running water, no bathroom, no refrigerator. This is Mrs. Hawkins. Project's headquarters was in Albany, which is the center of Southwest Georgia, and just a block or two up the street was the local pool hall. In the film I'll show shortly, Charles Sherrod mentions women's sewing and quilting cooperatives as one of the project's endeavors. And Susan made this woodcut while observing the women who you will see in the film doing that kind of work. As you can probably tell, I like most of Susan's work from this period, almost all of it, but this one I especially like. And it, believe me, does a nice job of capturing the power and determination of many of the women and mothers we knew at the time. While we were down there, I started fiddling around with film and motion picture film. I shot just silent scenes at first that are not much different than the still photographs you've seen, just kind of still photographs that move. But later I came back down in 1969 to record a series of interviews with the idea of making a film about the project's work. There was just one problem, which is that I didn't know how to make movies. And the film you're about to see, I'm afraid, reflects that. It suffers from a number of shortcomings. It has no narration to give you a context and an explanation of what you're about to see or have seen. People aren't identified with subtitles, so you're unlikely to know who's talking to you. So that there's often a lack of context for what you're viewing. I'm going to try to remedy this a little bit by briefly telling you a little bit about what you're about to see. The film opens with an off-camera voice-over account from a woman who was an eyewitness to the murder of a young black man named Junior Nelson at the hand of a white man, and that story is followed by scenes from his funeral. That's followed by Charles Sherrod, who I've told you is the director of the project, who talks about that murder and talks about the project's work. One of the things I'd like to call your attention to is that he talks about the importance of land ownership for blacks in the community, because that will relate to a little more of what I'll say after the film. Following Charles is a man named Walter Patman, who had the courage to run for office, which was a big deal then. He ran for coroner, and as you'll hear, he lost by 200 votes, which he and everyone else considered a victory. Following him, you'll hear from Ida Mae Young, who could well be the model for the woodcut of the woman at the end of the slide presentation. Wonderful, strong, powerful woman who will tell you about her children getting in trouble at school because they talked back to some white kids and how the school authorities handled that. She'll be followed by Randy Battle, who's one of the project staff I mentioned. He'll talk a little bit about the movement's effect on black self-consciousness, especially among the young. And the last speaker in the film is attorney C.B. King, a monumental figure in the movement. Civil rights lawyer, went off to law school, came back to his hometown of Albany, where he practiced for the rest of his life. He was the only black attorney in the region, and as you will hear in his interview, CB had the wonderful ability to speak in grandiose language that often flummoxed his opponents in the courtroom as well as the judge. CB has passed away, but as a measure of how things change, the federal courthouse in Albany, I believe, now bears his name.
I was up there in the store getting closer. when I come out of the store, I come out to look for them two boys to come home. I was on my way to come home, but me and him was getting groceries. When I walked out, the fight was going on. And they's gathering up so many guns and things, you know, and it shook me up. It frightened me, because I wasn't used to nothing like that. And I soon got away and come on away from up there. I wasn't up there when all them laws and different things was happening up there. I had left. But I did see the gun up in there, keeping the people away from this dead boy.
You saw that?
Yeah, I saw it.
Oh.
I really saw it. Yeah, I heard the shooting. I sure heard it. But now to see him shoot him, I just thought it was somebody, since all that was going on, somebody that shot a ball, you know, and scattered the people and stopped the fuss. I didn't know nobody was shot until I heard the people making an alarm about done shot Junior Nelson, done shot Junior Nelson.
The white man who murdered Junior Nelson is still free. 1,000 white men who murdered 1,000 black men are still free. But that's the nature of Southwest Georgia. That's the nature of the South. In Southwest Georgia, we walk with death daily, every day. How can you expect a little boy like this to come up knowing about what happened to his father without hating white people? We don't have to teach a young boy like this to hate, but from the early days of his life until the day he dies, if our country remains the same, he will be constantly bombarded by a racist society, by hatred, by discrimination, by all this evil. He's been taught that the black is ugly and evil and no good, and a black man should be ashamed of himself. But the Southwest Georgia Project is attempting to throw out these indoctrinations. We are trying to show him that black is what, Junior? Beautiful. And that black is to be proud. And he believes that now. We are teaching him to love, but not to love and forget. To love and remember all the evils that have been done to us, but to, in so remembering, to get such a commitment in life, a commitment to go on, despite the fact that we are like people who've been sent into a jungle of racism. The lion of racism come to us to devour our flesh. And we have nothing but our bare hands to subdue this racist lion of our society. But that's what we plan to do. whatever's necessary, we plan to subdue this lion, this racism, this evil. My name is Charles Sherrod, and I've been in Southwest Georgia since 1961. Southwest Georgia, the development of Southwest Georgia is akin to the development of my innermost self. For somewhere along the way I have put my blood and I have put my soul into its work and development. People who live in Southwest Georgia are mostly farmers. Men who have farmed all their lives and know nothing but farming. Land is the source of power. It's the source of all power. It's the source of life. And with land, a man holds in his hand the mechanism to control his destiny. If a people is going to rise, it must have land. And so we're trying to get a 4,800 acre plot of land in Lee County. We have a network of sowing bees, you might say. They're really groups of old women, middle-aged women getting together and making blankets, quilts, and dresses and so forth. In many cases, the women have not accepted monies which they make from the quilts as their personal income, but have pooled the funds and used them to further community development. We hope that one day that this would lead to a sewing factory, a central sewing factory, around which we will build a large number of chain factories, you may say, in different counties. In politics, we've had several people to run for office in South Georgia. We've never won. In another sense, we've never lost. Because the people who are trodden underfoot, any attempt to get from under the foot of this white man, this white racist in Southwest Georgia, is a success, believe me.
Now you and I, as white citizens and believers in the Christian religion, we realize that the principles that were set forth by our forefathers cannot succeed and stand up to the test by bowing down to any concessions or demands from any of the atheist so-called ministers of the nigger race.
I did a lot of voter registration work, and last year, 1968, I ran for coroner. I ran against a white man there in Clay County, and I did, I think, right well for the first kickoff. That's the first time a black person have ever ran in Clay County since Reconstruction Day, and we ran a good race. I think the white guy beat me about 200 votes. And, I think that's excellent for the first time, and that's why that we attempt to run for coroner. We figured that we could get enough black people registered where a Negro could win, and then we ain't finished. We gonna run a Negro in every election that come up in Clay County from now on.
I woke up this morning in my mind. It would stay on freedom. I woke up this morning in my mind. Stay on freedom. Woke up this morning with my
I'm the mother of 9 kids. My children been going to school ever since '65. And every time they went, I had trouble out of my children. I went to work, and I went to the schoolhouse, and went until the day that they picked up my children. Before my children was picked up, it comes about the children got where they couldn't get along in school. This is with the white children. They can get along with the white children in school. So they start picking at them, picking at those 2 children. So on the day of November the 4th, that when my 2 children was picked up, they was picked up from the schoolhouse. They took the children about 30 miles from home and didn't even tell us nothing to nobody, didn't even come by and let us know, just like it was kidnapping my children. Then we went on back home, saddened and wondering and crying and shedding tears, where was the children? Yet we didn't even know. So I said, Lord, what can I do, Jesus? So the only way that we could tell where our children, that we had to make a telephone call to Washington, D.C., to HEW, because it was so hurting to me that my children was taken out the home and crammed into a detention home for no reason in the world. And the white children were going free. Ain't missed a day out of school. Not done nothing, nobody but the black children. I just kept going and going and going, and I'm still going, and I'm not going to turn around. I'm going to continue to go on. I'm going to continue to send my children on to school so that they will be able to have the education that I think that they need to have. But this is one reason why that I really know that my children was picked up, see, because I'm the civil rights worker. I've been working in civil rights for a long time, 5 long years. And it brought about a lot of enemies after I was doing this. Because there was time that we'd be going to the poll and the white people would be rolling their eyes at me because I was bringing in so many carload of people to vote, you know. And they was knowing that they wasn't voting for their man, you know. And so they would be rolling their eyes at me. But this is the way that they thought maybe that they could do to stop me. But I won't be stopped. See, I'm going to continue and continue and continue. So you better get the detention homes ready and everything else, because I'm going to certainly get myself ready for them. And this is just the way I'm going to do that thing. They doing their thing, and I'm going to do my thing. We want justice, Lord, come by here. We want justice, Lord, come by here. We want justice, Lord, come by here. Oh, Lord, come by here. We all need you, Lord, come by here.
It was around the late 1964 that black folks really started sitting down and you know, began talking and thinking about what they really wanted. Because, you know, by then you had the hamburger stand and the movie theaters and the restaurants, you know, and that kind of stuff, and the motel. It was about 64 that the emphasis started to be put on black and proud, that it weren't so much of being able to mix up with white folk that was a thing, but it was what you thought of yourself. It was how you looked at yourself. The freedom didn't depend totally upon how much money you made. That money and cars and houses and association was comfort. That it was comfortable to be able to go sit down in a restaurant and eat a hamburger or some dinner and not have somebody throw coffee on you. You know, that it was comfortable to be able to afford that. But that if you went in there and nobody threw coffee on you and you was nervous, that, you know, that you had to hang up. You know, because you should have went in there and got your hamburger and your coffee and said, the hell with them folks, if they throw some coffee on me, I'm going to throw something back on them. Or hit them upside the head with this damn chair I'm sitting in.
You can't, I don't feel like that you can tell me to love everybody and that I'm the only one loving myself. That everybody isn't showing an interest in my love.
I think that what younger folks say is that, young black folks say is that the time has come now that we talk about blackness and only blackness, that everything we talk about it as being related to a black person in this country and the world, and how it's been related to them before and how you change that now.
So now the thing that we have to do is that we have to, get control of ourselves. That we have to, become a black unit.
We gonna march till we tear your kingdom down. We gonna march till we tear your kingdom down. It ain't no use you hanging around. You might well put your shotgun down, and we gonna march till we tear your kingdom down. We gonna work until we tear your kingdom down.
The question is asked relative to racism in the law. And certainly I think that my response to it is that it's very obvious that there is racism rampant or rife, not only on the state level, but the local level as well. It pervades the whole of the state of Georgia and the region hereabout. What I'm saying in another way is that the people who are responsible for the promulgation of the laws unconscionably participate or indulge themselves in the creation of laws that are calculated to serve those who have power. This, of course, means the whites in the state. It also is evident, that is, in terms of racism, in how the law is interpreted. The judges interpret the law in such a way as to serve the ends which are certainly antagonistic to those of blacks. One of the great deprivations experienced by black people in the region hereabout is a scarcity of black lawyers. Take myself, for instance. I am the only black attorney within a radius of over 100 miles. And of course, this means that the interest of many black clients go wanting at the hands of white attorneys or no attorneys at all. I see my role as a lawyer that of carrying on this war of attrition. This is to say that it's my commitment to do everything I can to alter fulfillment of what apparently is the purpose of the law in its relation to blacks. That is to say that where blacks were taken out and subjected to the barbarity of lynch mobs, they're now legitimately taken into the courtroom, and the same end is achieved. So I think that this is more important than any effort at my part to analyze it. Simply say to whites who are concerned about the direction in which America is headed that there is yet little time, that something has got to give, something in a very, very, very positive way has got to come about, or else America will not be America in the sense that white people like to feel secure in thinking about America.
Jordan River, who gon' help me cross? Jordan River, who gon' help me cross? Jordan River, who gon' help me cross? Oh, Lord, one more river, one more she'll be waiting. She can't help me to crawl. Oh, mother, she'll be waiting. She can't help me to crawl. Oh, mother will be waiting. Oh, Lord, she can't help me to cross. Oh, Lord, one more river, one more river to cross. Father, he'll be waiting. He can't help me to cross. Oh, Lord, Father, he'll be waiting. He can't help me to cross. Father will be waiting. Oh, Lord, he can't help me to cross. Yes, Lord, one more river, one more river to cross. Jesus will be standing. He will help me to cross. Oh, Lord, Jesus will be standing. He will help me to cross. Oh, Jesus will be standing. Oh, Lord, he will help me to cross. Oh, Lord, one more river, one more river to cross.
Thank you very much. Nice of you to sit through that. I'd like to do a couple of short additions. Since, as Guha has framed the series, it's about the movement, kind of past and future. You heard Charles talk in the film about land. And it was his dream at the time to get a large piece of land. You may have noticed he talked about 4,800 acre plot of land in Lee County. They got the land, and they got even more, 5,735 acres, and they got it in 1968 or 69. At the time, I think it was the largest piece of land owned by blacks in the country. And what immediately followed was a 5-year drought. So their farming operation really suffered, and they had a great deal of difficulty making the payments on the loans. And by 1985, they were deeply in debt, and they ended up losing the land. The project was called New Communities, and I'm going to show you a very brief interview with Charles in 1985, just days or weeks before they lost the land. You will find out shortly thereafter that, with another brief clip, I'd like to show you that the problem was not only natural, namely the weather, but was also human. Here's this little clip from Charles, 17 years after the land was acquired, when it was about to be lost. If I can get the mouse to work.
But our plight is not unlike thousands of farmers all over the country. But in Southwest Georgia, though, we've had 5 straight years of drought. And those 5 straight years have taken us under. Along with the policies of FHA, the way they're never on time, and they don't allow you to utilize your money up front. Well, we're about to lose our land. And it's a thing of a lot of pain to me, to my family, to other families that are associated with this project. And we don't see any way out of it. We appeal to the country. I've been on TV and newspapers, and I've made it known all the ways that I know how. Every leading civil rights organization, religious denomination in the country knows about our plight. But I guess times are so hard for them and the kind of goals that they have that they are unable to turn toward us at this time of our greatest need. We've held on about as long as we can. We attained this land when Martin Luther King died, around the time that 1968. We got this land. I had the opportunity to talk with Martin when he came to the city auditorium in Albany, Georgia, and asked him to be a part on the board and part of this whole attempt, and he agreed. Shortly after, in April, he died. But it could be a part of our dream, of our dream for this piece of land. But the sun is shining today, and I'm here on our land for these last few days, maybe. But who can tell? There may be a miracle. The money may still come from somewhere. I'm still holding out the faith that it will happen. But if it doesn't happen, then I'm not going to kill myself. I'm going to pick up from where I am and move on.
Will there be another piece of land if this one goes?
Hopefully. If it's the will of our people, if it's the will of God, then we'll get another piece of land.
So a few years later, there was a class action lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Agriculture by black farmers because there had emerged a lot of evidence that the USDA had been discriminatory in its loaning practices in the 80s. And while white farmers were getting plenty of loans, black farmers weren't. Charles's wife, Shirley, was working in that field at the time, and she was driving all over the South alerting farmers to this lawsuit and trying to get them to participate in it and recover some of the losses that they experienced because of discrimination. And this is so typical of Shirley. You may recognize her name from another USDA flap a couple of years ago. Shirley's driving around in Alabama recruiting farmers to join the lawsuit, and she's driving back home to Georgia. Suddenly dawns on her, wait a minute, we ought to be a part of this lawsuit. We had new communities. There's a measure of Shirley's, I don't know what, she's out there working for everybody else, and it suddenly dawns on her, we ought to be a part of this. So they joined the lawsuit as new communities. And I'd like to show you another little clip to bring the story full circle to today.
If it's the will of our people, if it's the will of God, then we'll get another piece of land.
On July 8, 2009, New Communities won an award of $12 million from the United States Department of Agriculture because it had been discriminated against in the denial of loans during the 1980s. They used the money to buy a new piece of land to replace the 5,735 acres they had lost in 1985 as a result of that discrimination. This new land comprises 1,638 acres and was named Cypress Pond Plantation at the time. Before the Civil War, it was the largest slave plantation in all of Georgia. The plantation features a large, elegant home, from which 150 slaves were sold in one day alone in December of 1859. Jefferson Davis stayed here while fleeing from the Union Army. Now this land will be developed as an agricultural and community center for the benefit of all poor citizens of Southwest Georgia, the original vision for new communities in 1969. They have renamed the land Resora, which means leads with love and embodies the essence of the human spirit. As Dr. King often said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Thank you very much.
So we have a little bit of time for Q&A and a moderated discussion led by David Cline. And you do have some time to ask questions, but David's going to pick up on some of the themes that Glenn touched upon here.
Great. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. So I want to start first. We're just gonna have a few questions back and forth, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. But I wanted to start by talking about something called the Student Interracial Ministry. This is how I found Glen when I was researching it. It's also how Charles and Glen first met. So when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was created at a meeting Easter weekend 1960 at Shaw University in Raleigh, at that very same meeting, and not too many people know this, there were a group of seminarians there from Union Theological Seminary in New York City, and then there was a group of black seminarians from Gammon. And they all sort of got together in the hallway or something and looked at each other and said, okay, we're part of this student movement, but we're also going into the church, and we have to change the church. Let's do something ourselves as well. And what that something was called the Student Interracial Ministry, which in its early expression, the idea was when seminarians had to work in churches to gain practical experience, they would do that in a church of another color. So black seminarians would go into white churches, white into black churches. And this is how the project sort of began and ran. This project, by the way, ran until 1968. In 1964, Charles Sherrod, the phrase he used to me was he took a movement sabbatical from Southwest Georgia. I think maybe the one and only time he left Southwest Georgia. To go to Union, he had a BD, he had in divinity, but he wanted to get a master's. And so he was at Union Seminary and sort of introduced Union Seminary to what was going on in Southwest Georgia. And that summer came back to Southwest Georgia with 5 seminarians, the next summer with 20, and then more and more, and overall I think it was 44 seminarians went down there. So I wanted to start with that and ask Glen to talk about being at Union, meeting Charles, and sort of put this all in a kind of a little bit of a spiritual context. I know that communicates in the footage, but I'd just like to hear that story from you.
David's got it right. Susan and I were recruited at a meeting at Union Seminary in '67, went down in '67, '68. There were other seminarians from Union and elsewhere. Charles is an ordained Baptist minister, talking about whites going to black churches and blacks going to white churches. I mean, you heard the music in that church. I mean, there's nothing as transformative as that. Very moving, and the music alone is enough to change your life. When I graduated from seminary, I requested ordination in my church to go back to Georgia, which my church, being a good liberal Protestant denomination, granted. So that's the connection. But for me, the biggest connection of all is being in those churches.
I also wanted to ask about, many historians of the civil rights movement, when they write about Albany, have called it a failure. They focus on King's work, and Albany wasn't able to get concessions, moved on, the movement's over in Albany, which is as far from the truth as it's possible to be when you look at it through the lens of the charades and others in the movement and how that movement continued and continues to today, as you can see. So one of your fellow seminarians who went down with charade and actually ended up staying there for 10 years, Joe Pfister, in 1968 wrote something that I want you to respond to, if you would. And he wrote at that time in 1968, he's looking forward and he's saying, in order for the Southwest Georgia movement to survive, we'll need a long-range perspective on the movement and a generous definition of progress. And I wonder if you could respond to that.
Just to drop a name, I was talking with Shirley a few days ago in preparation for today. And unprompted, she said to me, all the history books talk about the Albany movement as a failure. And they talk about that because that was one place where King got run out of town. Charles and Shirley have been doing this for 50 years, folks. And as you can see from, I wanted to show these two little clips at the end to show you how this thing has come full circle. I mean, if you look at the land issue, victory in 68, failure in 85, I'm not going to kill myself. I'm going to keep on going. Victory in 2008 or 9 or whenever it was. I mean, you talk about a long-term vision, that's what victory is. And so the history books, to the extent they reflect that opinion, have it wrong.
And maybe we could illustrate that. We could team tell this little story from 2009. We were down there together in the area, and the charades organized a bus tour of. There were a bunch of former volunteers. I got to tag along, and the bus tour went out into all the counties where these young men and women had worked 50 years earlier. And I had the best seat, I got to say. I was sitting right behind Shirley Sherrod and Charles Sherrod, and her cell phone kept ringing as we were driving around. And the first time she said, "Yeah, we're about an hour away." And then, "Yeah, we're about 15 minutes away. Yeah, we're about 5 minutes away." And finally I leaned forward and said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Just you wait." And we pull off the highway, and there's about 3 police cars and a fire truck sitting there. And what was the reaction of the...
I just asked David about this. I had this reaction, and I wasn't sure everybody else did. He confirms that most of the bus felt this way. Oh crap, what are they going to do now? This is 40 years later. They still going to mess with us? Well, they were there to escort us into town. It was the black sheriff and the black fire chief and members of the school board to escort us into town. This was Dawson, Georgia, in terrible Terrell County. Dawson is where, months before we arrived there in '67, the local project house had been shot into with a .50 caliber machine gun. Now we're getting escorted by the black sheriff and the black chief of police and the black fire chief. A measure of something for sure.
Absolutely an incredible moment. I want one final question, which is I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about, you were very humbly saying you didn't know how to make films at this point. Obviously you learned, as the Academy agreed a few years later. I wonder if you could talk about your growth as an activist and as a filmmaker, the work that you did with farm workers, and sort of where you saw this moment in your life and how that pushed you.
Well, it was a formative moment, both personally and professionally. The film has a lot of weaknesses, as you all witnessed, but I started making films then, and I've continued ever since, and it's been my career, and I've been privileged to be witness to things like this. Susan and I, a few years later, went on from Georgia and worked with United Farm Workers, and made a film there, and after that I have made film for the labor movement and other progressive organizations. So it was a watershed for me. And much as I wince at the shortcomings of the film, I also, it's some of the best photography I've done, and it was a privilege to be present, to be able to photograph the real folks, the real heroes of the movement.
And I'll just say, as someone who's interested in history and came following this trail so many years later, it's just such a treasure trove to find this. And we're so grateful to you for bringing this to the Library of Congress, and the Library of Congress for taking in this tremendous collection. So let's turn it over to you for questions for Glen. Anyone like to start us off? Yes.
What happened to the two children that you picked up and taken away?
You mean the Ida Mae Young story? You know, it's been so long I can't remember. I think they were basically thrown out of school, probably. Typical kind of this struggle, but that family, you don't mess with that family.
How did they get back?
She had this. She didn't know where they were. Nobody would tell her. She says she had to call Washington D.C. I don't know all the details, but they finally found their kids. But I don't know. I honestly don't know whether they ever went back to that school or not. But just typical. Just what folks had to endure. 9 kids in that family, and you saw how strong that woman is. Don't mess with Ida Mae Young. Anybody else?
Glenn, I wanted to take you back to the very beginning, and how did you end up in Montgomery? You sort of alluded to it a little bit, but I wanted to take you back to 1965, if you would, and talk about that, if you would.
Guha's going to make me do another name dropping. As I said, I was on my school newspaper when Bloody Sunday happened. I think he was managing editor at the time. He was in the next year president. This was the Harvard Crimson. Donnie Graham was the managing editor of the Crimson at the time. Donnie said, we should cover this. And had enough commitment to do it that he loaned us his car. So 3 of us got in Donnie Graham's Mustang convertible and drove down to Montgomery overnight, drove overnight. And it took a couple days, at least a couple hours to get acclimated, by which I mean, 3 Harvard white boys in a Mustang, drive around the black part of town and trying to take photographs of the SNCC mass meetings. Well, it all worked out, but I have to say that's a tribute to Donnie's vision that guided him through 30 or 40 years as publisher of the Post. Anybody else?
Glenn, do all of your films center around civil rights, or do you do other subjects as well?
No, I would say that this film and the farm worker film are my 2 movement films. Since then, I've done other similar things the most similar things to stuff I've done for labor unions in the 70s and 80s. I've done some other work that I'm particularly pleased with for local national organization, Alliance for Justice, their struggle with the courts, court appointments, Supreme Court. That kind of stuff is what I've done.
What was the reaction in reference to your immediate family? I know if I had a child at that age driving in a convertible in that part of the country during that time, I'd be a nervous wreck.
No, if we were nervous, it soon passed. Within a few days, we were part of the family.
No, your family, your mom, your dad. Your
That. Sure. I mean, Susan and I come from St. Louis, both raised in good Midwestern Republican families who were probably scared to death when we went down to Georgia. Probably disapproving, but my father would never tell me, but my mother whispered to me years later that he had he joined a couple of Dr. King's marches, which was very gratifying to me. You know, people are who they are and people change. And we should be grateful for that. Thank you for that question. Anybody else?
Here comes Mike.
The film at the end indicates it's a film of the Southwest Georgia project. And do they use that as a way of gaining support? How was it used?
That's a good question, and the answer is mostly I'm not sure. I made it for Charles and the project to use it for fundraising and organizing. I'm sure he did, but I have a fault of many people who make works that you finish it. You want to make the piece, you want it to be good, and then you're on to the next thing. And I'm not an organizer. I'm a lousy organizer, and so my intent was to put this in the hands of people who are good organizers so they could use it. Good question, because I know you're a good organizer.
I'll just say I think it was used that way for at least a little while, and when I was sort of following the breadcrumb trail, I started to hear from people, oh, hey, there was this guy, Glen Pearcy, who was down there, and he shot, took some photographs, great photographer, you actually set up a dark room, right, and shot this footage. So then I was on that trail to sort of find it, but I don't think it had been seen in quite a while.
Speaking of which, I would encourage anybody who has a question about any of the still photographs, maybe nobody does, but I didn't want the film to overwhelm the stills. If anybody has a question about still photographs they saw, I'd be happy to answer them.
I have the same question about the stills, which is how were they used?
Same answer. Same. I mean, I don't think about, it's strange. I don't think about how, and don't follow up on how they're used. I take the photographs, and I'll tell you one way they were used. David was there. We were back a couple years ago for the 50th anniversary of the founding of the project, which was founded in '61. And I took a dozen or 2 dozen of the photographs from Georgia down and put them up on a board. And people came by and were moved. I know him. And for me, it was difficult because that beautiful shot of the Hall children in their kitchen, 2 in the back, 1 in front. Somebody came up and said, well, he's dead. He's dead. In several of the photographs. Those are always children. I suddenly realized those are children in my mind. They can't be dead. Look at those children, They're alive forever. Anyway, that's just me.
Glenn, it seems that the technology of making the sorts of images that you make 50 years ago is much more available now. But I wonder if we have the same interest in generating the sort of document that you've generated in answer to social problems and environmental problems and societal problems today.
I don't know. I think there are filmmakers and photographers out there doing that sort of thing. We're in a different period now, and the country is not in a revolutionary period. That may be a little big, but it was a. So Susan and I were lucky to have been at the center of that for a few years, and what does Woody Allen say? 90% of genius is showing up. Well, we were lucky enough to be there, and I was lucky enough to have a camera in my hand. I will just make one little comment about that. I have been working on the stills for Guha for some time now, and by today's standards, I'm astonished at how few images I made. Now, I made dozens, but a still photographer with a digital camera today takes dozens every minute, you know? A still photographer today in that situation would take at least 100 times as many photographs as I took. And it's partly because of the technology. You had to shoot the film, you had to buy the film, you had to, I built a darkroom in the back of the shack we lived in, you know? You had to process it with chemicals and all that sort of stuff. It was all more, everything was more precious, and you didn't just rattle it off. You thought about what you were going to shoot, and then you shot it. But anyway.
Actually, I'd like to add one editorial comment to that, just to pick up on that last point. We at the American Folklife Center, and I think Marisha Battle and others who curate photography collections, are the heirs to the legacy of photographers who just put their cameras on automatic and just shoot away till they don't know what's in front of their camera anymore. And it's a pleasure to watch somebody like Glen, who is such a meticulous craftsman. I've had a chance to see some of the photographs, who frames the shot, who actually knows what it means to like shoot in context, who actually knows how to like, you know, give you something about the visual image. And those images of the Jenkins Church are just absolutely stunning. The shot of Dr. King is just, you know, luminous. And maybe, you know, somebody who shot 15,000, you know, shots of that might have been able to pick one, but it's right to Glen's hand. So I think there's something about the discipline that Glen's talking about in terms of his craft, which is really, really important, which I think gets lost in this digital age that we now inhabit.
Let me amplify that on just very briefly, and this is not patting myself on the back, it's letting you know how much things have changed. Many of those photographs are the only frame I took of that scene. The one I like of the little boy on the bed watching I think it's his older cousin practicing the trombone. I don't know if you noticed that or not. That's just one frame. There's not 7 of those, or 77 of those, there's one. The shot of Rosie and her son, the blind woman, there's 2 or 3 frames of that. You know, the training we went through then, the way we learned then was you find the right moment and you take the picture. You don't put your camera up and let it rattle on and then go back and look through all 127 frames and find the right one. You find the right one before you take the picture.
This may be an obvious point, but I just want to add what an incredibly important part of the movement witnessing is. Being there and witnessing in this way and allowing other people to be there. And certainly, I think of like the strength of Emmett Till's mother and having an open casket and the incredible impact of that image, that image had, witnessing all around the country.
Yeah. Do you have any still photographs of the funeral of, I believe his name is Junior in the beginning of the film?
The funeral was in the film? No, I was totally occupied with the little motion picture camera I had, so I don't have any stills of that.
Okay, I think that wraps it up, please. A round of applause for Glen Pearcy and David Cline.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.